So, I'm going to talk a bit about the two biggest roadblocks in spiritual awakening that I notice and what to do about them. So, for those of you who are not already aware, my name is Mary Mueller-Schutan. I've written a bunch of books about spiritual awakening, and more significantly, I've worked for the last 20 years not only with my own awakening, but with clients and students and all of that going through awakening as well. So these are not just my thoughts, they're what I've noticed in large groups of people over time. So the first block that people tend to have when going through spiritual awakening is that they get immersed in their current suffering. What happens during spiritual awakening is that anything that is not consciousness, anything that is not our natural state of flow, is going to come up to be processed and cleared. So, in simple terms, what is this? This is a lot of emotions we've held on to. There's a lot of baggage. It's trauma we've experienced. It's anything that we've experienced that was too much for us to process at the time. We kind of, shoved down into our bodies, into our tissues. And during spiritual awakening, what happens is that our body seeks a natural state of flow. And anything that is not that state of flow will come up. In my book, The Spiritual Awakening Guide, I kind of talked about this as like basically being like a river or an ocean or a stream, and then it hitting boulders. And those boulders are the traumas we've experienced, the beliefs we have that, aren't doing us any good, all of that sort of stuff. Um, and so as you go deeper into awakening, it's not just your personal trauma. It's also things like ancestral patterns, karmic patterns, past life issues, um, religious beliefs, sort of mythic beliefs, all of this sort of stuff that our parents and communities have taught us. Those all come up for us to examine and for us to work our way through. One of my favorite descriptions for awakening, or for what we might term enlightenment, is the end of conflict. And so anything within us that is suffering, anything within us that is in conflict will arise for us to look at and work our way through and heal. The reason that this is such a roadblock is that we tend to pay attention to where we are and what we're currently going through. We tend to forget about our pain and suffering once we have experienced it. There's very good biological and energetic reasons, for this happening. If any woman truly remembered her childbirth, she likely wouldn't have another child. Just one example and a small joke, but this is what happens with our pain is that we experience it, we move through it, and then we move on. We need to move on with our lives. And then a part of us sort of forgets it. And so with this roadblock, what happens is that we start to develop this mentality when we're going through spiritual awakening or just going through life that we're going through endless suffering, that the pain is never going to end, that the patterns are never going to end, that stuff just keeps on coming up. Maybe we work through one pattern and then another one comes up. Maybe we work through a big reservoir of anger, and then a big, a big outburst of sadness comes up or arises. And so the best advice I have for this is to, if you are going through a spiritual awakening in which this is happening gradually or sort of, some people experience pattern by pattern, and some people experience essentially like a fire hose. So if you're going through a Kundalini awakening, it can kind of feel like a fire hose, and 1,000 patterns coming up and emotions coming up at once. So the best advice I can have for you is to take a moment and reflect on who you are today, who you are in this moment, and who you may have been 5 minutes ago, 6 months ago, 6 years ago. Because if you are going through a spiritual awakening, your perspective, how you react to situations, how you deal with life, how you deal with stress, that will change over time. And so if you get into a situation where you notice, hey, I would have reacted differently to that type of person 6 months ago or 5 minutes ago for some of us, um, that can be a very good thing to pause, take note of, because you are noting your progress, not just the pain that you are currently in. Along with that is also taking a moment to celebrate what you've worked through. Spiritual awakening, some facets of it can be really difficult. It requires somebody to put in some effort, some accountability, some responsibility to really turn inward and to look at the emotions that are coming up, the patterns that are coming up, the conflicts that are arising, the beliefs that are arising. Um, and just like I said, we tend to forget about those, about what we believed, what we thought to be true, what type of suffering and beliefs that we were operating under once we move past them. And so I suggest having a journal, doesn't have to be elaborate, or just taking a moment to sort of pat yourself on the back for going through spiritual awakening and for all of the growth that you've experienced during your time spiritual awakening. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of this first roadblock is to understand that you are working towards a particular goal. And that goal is that end of conflict. We only have so much childhood trauma to work through, even the most traumatized of us. We only have, believe it or not, so much ancestral and past life and karmic and religious and all of that sort of conditioning to work through. At some points, it may feel endless, but it really does have an end and it really does shift. So keep that in mind that things do really shift. If you do put in the effort, if you do look within, um, and typically what happens is that things change. There's often a dynamic shift when we reach the end of kind of our own stuff, our personal stuff. That's the really heavy stuff. If we're talking about the word enlightenment, really the biggest part of it is light. It is a lightening process, except we have all of these heavy energies of trauma, of what's happened to us in our childhoods, all that sort of stuff that is really bogging us down. And so keeping in mind that this process does have a specific goal, it is to heal, it is to evolve, it is to get to a point where you are releasing and eventually feeling lighter and eventually no longer following the same patterns and beliefs and destructive sort of experiences that you once did, breaking all of those loops. We tend to do the same things, repeat the same things, get in the same relationships again and again. And spiritual awakening, during that time, we have the honor of breaking those loops. And so remind yourself that none of this lasts forever and that you can move forward in your process and notice what changes you've gone through. So the second roadblock, this is one that I always, occasionally get hate mail about because it is difficult to notice in ourselves. But if you are willing to notice it, you can make so much progress. You can move past this roadblock smoothly and easily. And this roadblock is, I will kind of talk about it as in, we always think of our first step as being our last. The way we can see this most clearly is in, students and people and maybe our past selves who, when we knew a little bit about spirituality, we kind of thought we were at the end of our path. And so we can see this quite clearly in people who've, taken a single course or read a single book, or maybe meditated for a couple weeks, and all of a sudden they think that, they're enlightened or something like that. Um, and so, while it is present in that population, it also happens all throughout our path. We have a tendency to think that we are much further than we actually are on our path. And so I'm going to share something that some people may fight against. And that is the understanding that spiritual awakening makes people more human. It results in humility. It results in an experience of understanding that the stuff that I am composed of is no different than the stuff that you are composed of. What the ego desires is to be superior, to have power, to be a demigod. And all of that comes from inner feelings of inferiority, inner feelings of feeling worthless, unlovable, not good enough. What happens when we solve those things within ourselves, when we heal those things within ourselves, is that we come out of it recognizing that we are good enough just as we are. We do not need to accomplish another thing. We do not need to be better than anybody else. We don't need to, take power from anybody else. All of that happens if we are willing to move past this incredibly common roadblock into a state of recognizing that our ego tries to fool us, first of all, into thinking that we are further than we are. Because what's a great way to keep ourselves stuck? It's to think of ourselves as being superior to everyone else. It is thinking of oneself as enlightened. Well, guess what? If you think that you are enlightened, what happens is that you don't need to do any more work because you're enlightened and you're already superior to everyone and anyone around you. One of the things that happens is when you get out of that cycle of kind of personal stuff and you really start looking at this very clearly, there can be an understanding that spiritual awakening really is about becoming more and more human, more and more imperfect. You can break down or even directly look at the parts of you that need to feel superior. You can heal the parts of you that feel inferior. Because when we heal the parts of ourselves that feel inferior, we no longer need to be Superman. We no longer need to kind of present ourselves as being superior to anyone else. We can just be as we are. And so this can be a tricky one for people because our ego is protective. And what it's trying to do is that all of those parts that are unhealed within us, they're trying to sort of mount a protective barrier where we do not look directly at the pain. And so what happens is that if we feel inferior or worthless, we will project or try to project an image of being superior or filled with power, or some, magical creature or something like that. And if this can be questioned and looked at, is that you will work your way past this roadblock into an understanding and basic consciousness level of recognizing that no matter how much we know, what happens when we truly gain knowledge is that we will notice the the sort of limits of our knowledge, of our wisdom. The same thing happens for consciousness. It is called infinity for a reason. The more conscious we become, the more aware we become of the limits of our consciousness. We become we aware how we occupy only a certain percentage of that infinity. And a lot of people don't like that thought of cosmic insignificance, but it actually can be the experience of it quite comforting. And so I do realize that part of the sort of play, part of the sort of like facade of spiritual awakening is the all-knowing guru and the student. But if you are able to break that down within yourself, if you are able to kind of see within yourself your own light, your own worth, your own power, you can become that guru. You can become that human and become fully human and move past this roadblock, which is a block for so many, where so many people get stuck for so long, and kind of work your way out of the play of spiritual awakening into authentically experiencing it. So I hope that that helps you all who are watching it. Thank you for watching.